In this lesson video, we are going to discuss more in-depth about different selection features in Blender, such as the selection tools and their modes, and also using the interactive selection method. If you click and then hold on the select tool, you can see there are 4 different selection tools that we can use. Previously, we have covered the tweak tool, and we also have covered the default select box tool briefly. But let's go over them again one by one. First is the tweak tool. Previously in Blender version 2.8, this tool was called the select tool. But since Blender 2.81, the name has changed to tweak tool, which I think is better suited to how the tool works. This tool lets you move and drag objects quickly in a single operation. Next is the select box tool. This is actually the default select mode when we first open Blender. Essentially, with this tool, we can create a selection by drawing a rectangle in the viewport. Next is the select circle tool. In other 3D application, this type of selection method is often called the select paint tool. With this tool, we can click and drag like we are painting on the canvas. The mouse cursor will change into a circle, and every object get touched by the circle will be selected. Now, you need to be aware that in object mode, when doing circle selection like this, an object will get selected only if its origin touched by the circle. If you only touch the geometry, it will not get selected, okay? If you want to resize the brush or the circle size, you can go up here and type or drag the value left or right. If you need to make it back to the default value, we can use the hover and backspace method. Now this bar here is actually called the tool settings. If you right-click and choose this checkbox, the bar will be hidden. To show it again, you can go to the View menu and then choose Tool Settings. Another way to access the Tool Settings parameter is by going to the Sidebar panel. In the Tool tab here, we can see the same parameters that we have up here. The last selection tool is the Select Lasso tool. This is like the lasso selection tools you see in 2D graphics software. Essentially, you draw a selection region freely by clicking and dragging the mouse. And just like the Select Circle tool, you also need to include the origin of the object to get that object selected. If you only touch the geometry, the object will not get selected. To activate the selection tool via shortcut, you can press Shift Spacebar and then press and hold on this top tool. Then drag to any of the selection tools listed here, and then release the mouse. But the shortcut method is just too slow as there are too many steps involved. Another shortcut method that we can use to activate and to cycles between these selection tools is the W shortcut. Notice if I have this move tool active, if I press W, immediately the last selection tool active will be active again. Pressing W again will select the next selection tool. If you press W again several times, it will cycle back to the tool we have before. Besides, in the object mode, these selection tools are also available in the edit mode. Let's select this sphere and then go to the edit mode. We can use the select box tool to select vertices like this, for example. Or if we go to the face mode and use the select circle tool, we can paint on the object surface to create a selection like this. Or we can use the select lasso tool to create a freeform region to select mesh elements. If we have the selection tools active, that is, other than the tweak tool, for example, if we select the select circle tool here, we can see here there are different selection tool modes. By default, it is set to New Selection at the left, meaning every time we draw a selection, it always clears the previous one and create a new selection. Now, if we set this to Add Mode or Extend Mode here, when we draw a selection, it will not remove the previous one. Instead, it will just keep adding more selection. If we use the Subtract mode, then every time we draw, the objects or sub-objects that are touched by the selection circle will be deselected. Now, if we use the Select Box tool or the Select Lasso tool, we have two additional selection modes. First is the invert mode. Essentially, invert will add the selection, but within any area overlapped with the previous selection will get deselected. The last one is intersect mode. This is the reverse of the invert mode. If we have a selection and then create another selection that overlaps the previous one, everything will get deselected except for the overlapping area. If it is too bothersome for you to go back and forth to the top area and prefer to use shortcuts instead, you can hold Shift to add selection, hold Ctrl to subtract selection, and hold both Shift and Ctrl together to intersect selection. So using this method, you can be in any mode up here, it doesn't really matter. For example, you can just set the mode at the default new mode here. Then, to add more selection, hold Shift and then drag like so. We can see more and more faces get selected. If we press and hold Ctrl, then we are reducing the selection. And if we hold Shift and Ctrl together, now we are in the intersection selection mode. Besides using the selection tools, in Blender, you can use a faster way to do these different types of selection. That is why I prefer to use this method instead. The official document stated that this method is called the interactive selection mode. We can use B shortcut to access the box selection mode, and C shortcut to access the circle selection mode. But name aside, this method is actually what we have been using in Blender for so long before version 2.8. What makes this method faster is because you have shorter keyboard shortcuts, and also you can be in any tool to use this method. I mean, you can be in the scale, or rotate, or move tool, etc. to access this method. So this can prevent you from having to move your mouse back and forth between the tools. To show you what I mean, let's activate the Move tool here. And as you can see, I am inside the Edit mode and in the Face Selection mode. So, to access the box selection, you can press B. You will see these vertical and horizontal lines in the viewport. If you drag like this, you create a rectangular selection region. Basically, it works like the Select Box tool we previously used. But notice, we are still in the Move tool when doing it. In terms of using the modifier key, when you press B and do a rectangular selection like this, it always performs in the Add Selection mode. So, you always adding more and more selection. If you want to subtract the selection, you can hold the Shift modifier key. So, press B, then hold Shift, then drag like this. Or another way to do this is by using the middle mouse button. So press B, then instead of clicking and dragging with the left mouse button, you can click drag with the middle mouse button. Next is the circle selection. To access it, you can press C on the keyboard. Just like the box selection before, by default, the circle selection will perform in the Add Selection mode. So it will keep adding more selection. To subtract the selection, you can hold Shift and drag with your left mouse button, or you can also click drag using the middle mouse button instead. What's so cool about this circle selection method compared to the Select Circle tool we discussed before is that we can use the mouse scroll wheel to change the brush size. To exit this circle selection mode, we can either press Escape or Enter or simply right-click. Next is using the Lasso Selection tool. To access it, by default, there is no letter key assigned for this feature. What you need to do is to hold the Control key and then drag using the right mouse button. As with before, by default, it works in the Add Selection mode. So it will keep adding more and more selection. To subtract the selection, you need to hold Control and Shift together, then drag with the right mouse button, okay? Now, I must warn you though about this method. If you mistakenly right-click Release instead of clicking and dragging with the right mouse button, notice what happened. Blender will extrude the currently selected faces. So, Control and drag with the right mouse button is used for lasso selection, But Control and right-click release is for extruding. Very subtle input difference, but produce totally different results. So again, this is something you need to be aware of and keep in mind. In this course, after this lesson forward, I will use this interactive selection method more often than the selection tools because it is just faster to perform.